My name is Heather Meadows Adamson. I'm a premium tutor here at Ruth. So tonight we're going to talk about kind of a little bit of everything, right? SAT versus ACT. We'll talk about some timelines for your student based on, where they are in school. And kind of generally talking about the expectation of colleges. We'll also talk a little bit about how the testing world has changed post-COVID. So like I said, I'm a premium tutor. I've been here with Ruth for about 5 years now, a little over 5 years. One of my favorite things to do is give these presentations. I really like to demystify some of the parts of the testing world for you guys in the college admissions process. And so I just ask that any questions, we are going to have a question section at the end. Just try to keep them until the end. Is more than likely I'll answer a lot of them, especially some of the specific ones. But like I said, at the end, we'll have time for questions. So kind of just to introduce Ruth a little bit, we really believe that when you change students' self-beliefs, you change their lives, which kind of goes into building skills for school and beyond. So building up confidence, just general skills they use to navigate the world beyond the academic world. So we offer academic tutoring, test prep, and executive function coaching. So these are all things we offer for you guys. As I said, tonight, we're going to start with some SAT versus ACT stuff. Then we're going to talk about how to prepare for that testing in the first place, how to figure out what grades you need, right? Or scores you need, I'm sorry. Talk about updates in the testing world post-pandemic. Talk about next steps by grade, and then we'll have questions at the end. So let's dive on in and talk about SAT versus ACT. So structurally, the two tests are pretty similar. They're both going to have a reading section. They're both going to have a writing, English, grammar section. Both have math. The SAT has a math with no calculator and a math with calculator, but those grades are combined together to give you an overall math score. And then you'll see the ACT does have a science section, which the SAT doesn't. We'll talk about that. The SAT no longer offers an essay, and the ACT still does have an optional essay. That is something that's kind of started to die out, essentially. But I would just keep a lookout if there's a certain school that mentions they require the essay. It's pretty rare to have that, but just keep an eye out as you're looking at schools to know if you need to take the ACT essay, if you're going to take the ACT. So the good thing is that overall 75 to 80% of the test content overlaps. So in general, you're going to have reading comprehension skills, reading a passage and answering questions about it, English grammar skills, so correcting grammar, correcting wording, punctuation, reading graphs and interpreting them. You'll see that in both the math sections of both tests, and then of course the science section of the ACT. And in general, you're going to see Algebra 1 and 2, stats, and then some geometry in both. The differences come in some different ways, right? So on the SAT, you're going to have more advanced reading section. By that, the reading passages are going to be a little more complex, and the questions are going to be more complex as well, and more math word problems. The SAT is just more reading heavy in general, and you'll see it in all the sections. The ACT, on the other hand, you're going to have more advanced science by simply having the science section, right? We'll talk, like I said, that's a little bit specific, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to know all of chemistry, physics, and biology to do well. And then more advanced math, you're going to see a larger variety of math topics on the ACT, and it will go into some of those harder topics you don't see maybe until late pre-cal, calculus, things like that. The amount of time per question is a really big difference in the two tests. So as you see here, you're going to have 33% more time on the writing questions in the SAT, 43% more time on the reading questions in the SAT, and 40% more time per math question on the SAT. The SAT overall is just a more forgiving test as far as timing goes, which can benefit some students, but it's a more complicated test in other ways, right? So even though you get pretty much almost 50% more time per question in the reading section, that makes the reading section 65 minutes long, which that can be hard to have such a long section you're working on. And as we talked about, the passages can be more difficult too, so you may need that time to work through them. On the other hand, the ACT can be fast, which works for some students, but for some other students, right, that reading section on the ACT, you are doing 40 questions in 35 minutes. For some students who perhaps, just read a little bit slower or something, that's really stressful. Maybe the SAT is better, even though the reading passages are more complex. So these are just things you kind of think about as you talk to your student, or if you're a student watching, of course, maybe you're already starting to say, yeah, that's definitely me, or yeah, that's not me. Some kind of things that you should be thinking about as we're talking about the differences between these tests. Let's talk about the math, right? So the SAT, about 62% of the questions is going to cover algebra. So it's Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, kind of that covers both of those classes. On the ACT, it's still the biggest section, 46%. But then we see a huge difference in this next one, right? Geometry. So in the ACT, it's 23% of the questions are geometry based. SAT, it's only 6%. So, if geometry is a class you took freshman or sophomore year and it's been a long time, maybe that was the year it was COVID and it was online learning, maybe it's time to just review some geometry, right? Or alternatively, if you're like, absolutely not, I refuse, maybe it's an SAT choice for you. So again, things to think about the differences between the tests. The arithmetic, data analysis, stats, pretty even for both tests. You'll notice the ACT has a little bit more trig, 7% compared to 2%. And again, that comes in the fact that you have a wider variety of questions. So on the SAT, your trig usually isn't anything too crazy, maybe some basic sine, cosine, tangent. ACT, you may get some trig identities, some trig graphs, a little bit, just more in depth in the questions. The reading section, right? So the SAT, the reading difficulty varies a lot. And by that, I mean, you may open up with a literature passage from the 1960s. It's pretty approachable, pretty easy to read. And the next passage could be an Abraham Lincoln speech, right? It's just really old, perhaps the language is a barrier. So again, right, you get more time per question, but you get more spikes in difficulty like that, right? So you have something to be prepared for on the SAT. It's something to kind of work for and think about, what types of passages are more difficult for me? What types do I feel better about? The ACT, on the other hand, the difficulty is really level. You kind of get about like National Geographic magazine reading level is how I would describe it. Pretty approachable, but again, very fast, right? We talked about 40 questions in 35 minutes. So things to outweigh, right? No, neither test is easier than the other. It's really student preference, right? What does your student feel more confident at? What are they better at, perhaps? So these are things you weigh as you think about these two tests. And lastly, let's look at the ACT science section. It is unlike anything on the SAT, right? Which is a little bit weird. So kind of to compare themselves to the ACT science test, the SAT has added some science and some graphs into the reading and even into the English and math sections. So you'll see it, kind of throughout the test, but nothing dedicated to science. So like I said a minute ago, you do not need to be good at chemistry, bio, or physics to do well in this section. And, conversely, if you are good at those and you do, not great in this section the first time you take it, don't be worried, right? This test is not really about your scientific knowledge. This is more about, do you know how to read, a description of an experiment, look at the results, and draw conclusions? So for example, this one we have right here is talking about cyanobacteria and how much light they absorb and how they convert that into energy and the frequency of the light. Not something we're taught in school, right? The idea behind this is that you don't already know this information, but they're going to ask you questions about the graphs that's going to have you draw conclusions. So it's more about reading graphs, reading data, and being able to interpret it. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be good at biology, or if you're good at biology, this may be hard for you for totally different reasons. So again, not something to kind of equate, directly with your science classes. Again, very weird section. This one is definitely, you got to take one to see what it is like, to kind of get an idea of how this one works. So nuts and bolts of those tests, right? And I'll kind of return to you about how we think about the two tests. The first thing is how to register for the test, right? The SAT is run by the College Board, which also runs the PSAT and all of the AP exams. So you probably already have a College Board account. So you will just log on there and you can set locations, etc. Pretty easy. The ACT has its own website. It's a different company. It's act.org. Again, you have to make an account there too. Only you can register your student for these tests. No exterior, outdoor, or no other company can do that. Sometimes schools will offer in-school tests, and that is a whole different thing. You'll speak to your guidance counselor about that. Accommodations are also something to think about. So if your student has accommodations in school, meaning they have like an IEP, they receive extra time for a certain diagnosis, anything like that, you want to make sure you're already thinking about this. So if you need accommodations for either test, which definitely, if you are someone who needs those, you absolutely should get them, and so you can do your best on this test. You work with your school's guidance counselor or disabilities coordinator, whoever you have talked to previously about accommodations, and they'll kind of help you submit the correct paperwork. What's nice about the SAT is that since the College Board operates all three of those things I mentioned, the SAT, the PSAT, and AP exams, you can just apply once, and if you get accepted, you never have to apply again for any of those, right? Because it's the same company and they keep that on file. A little strangely, the ACT is different. You have to reapply for accommodations every time you take it. So for example, if you're taking the ACT in June and July, you want to make sure you're thinking of that ahead of time and sending in those applications early. So just so you get it in time. So again, something to think about as you're making these schedules. And as a reminder, colleges cannot see when a student has taken a test with accommodations. That is against the law. So again, don't think that will hurt your chances or anything like that. You need to get the accommodations that you need, right? So you can do the best you can. Super scoring is really interesting as well. So the idea behind super scoring is that, oops, I don't know why that messed up again. So let's say, okay, let's say you take the SAT 3 times, right? Let's say you take it in March and your verbal's okay, but you had really worked on studying your math. You did awesome on it. You got a 670. The next time in May, you're really tired. Maybe you were at a friend's birthday party the night before. Maybe you had a cold. Maybe you've just been really cranking down for finals and stuff. And you just don't do as well as you wanted to. That's okay. It happens, right? In June, you've really been working on studying your verbal, right? You really wanted to bump that score up. So you really did. You got a really great score. But you kind of forgot to review your geometry and your algebra. So your math didn't come up as well. But what's great about super scoring is it allows students to combine like your top scores from each section across different test dates, kind of like a best of score, and it gives you a new composite score. And that's what most schools look at. And so again, what's great about that is that you can kind of mix and match these. And again, you can focus on different sections, right? As you take the test a couple times, it allows you to, kind of not try to do everything all at once. So it makes it a little bit easier for you on that way. And the vast majority of schools will super score the SAT. I would say about 90%. Many will super score the ACT about 80 to 85%. The biggest thing is just to find out, right? Look at the schools that you are thinking about and find out, which ones do and don't. And, that may change your test choice as well, right? Like I said, most schools will do both, but it's always worth double checking. All right. So effective prep, right? Okay, we know about these 2 tests. We know how the scores work. How do we get started, right? So the first thing is to find those score ranges online, figure out what numbers you need, right? So what I really recommend looking up is, you're going to take the name of whatever school you're interested in, whichever ones you are, and you're going to go online and you're going to type in freshman profile. Those are the 2 magic words, and then put the name of the school. I'm just going to put UGA. That's where I went to school. So I'm going to search that. And what's going to pop up most of the time is a web page on the school's website talking about, giving you some stats from their most recently admitted freshman class. Schools like to do this. They like to brag about the students that come there. Most schools are going to have this page. Some schools, you may see it like hidden within another page. If you don't see it for some reason, you can probably either, email or call the admissions office and ask them for these numbers. Usually they're able to give them to you. But anyway, you're going to look up that page and it's going to give you all kinds of info from stuff like all the different countries their students came from, all the different activities they did, just kind of fun things. And then there's going to also be the useful stuff, right? You're going to see some numbers about the SAT, ACT scores from that class. So if you only see one number, you can guarantee it's this middle 50th percentile. Some schools will give you all 3, right? But what we're focusing on is this middle 50th percentile number. The reason is that that's the middle 50% of students accepted, right? Kind of a nice middle chunk of scores. We don't want to look at the kids who had the bottom 25th percentile, right? We don't want to say like, oh, they accepted someone with a 1100. That's it. I just got a 1100. I'm a shoo-in. No, more than likely, it's a student who's an athlete, whose family has given a lot of money to the school, right? So unless you are really good at a sport, you guys have a lot of money sitting off to the side, we probably want to focus in the middle 50th percentile. And the top 25%, right? Those are students who maybe this school was a safety school for them, people who are really overachievers, right? You're going to see some kids who get perfect scores, right? So we're not telling ourselves we have to get a perfect score to get into every school, right? The middle 50th percentile is the competitive set. The idea is that once you get a score within that range, you're starting to have a really good chance, right? So what I really recommend you guys doing is, getting a notebook or a Google Doc or whatever it is that works best for your family, and putting down a list of schools, right? Saying these are the schools I'm interested in, and then start to look up this information, right? Look up this middle 50th percentile, write down those numbers. Look up, do they super score the SAT and the ACT, right? Ask those questions. keep all this information in the same spot, right? Things like, when is the application date as well, right? Are there any scholarships we're thinking about? And then once you have all that in one place, you can start to be like, okay, this is what it looks like for me, right? Are these scores similar? Does it seem like I need to get just kind of within a similar score range to do these applications? Are there a couple schools whose scores are way higher? Do I need to work more towards those? Again, questions to ask yourself and to talk about with your family. So again, I really advise doing the research ahead of time. It saves you a lot of stress down the road, and having it all in one place is helpful as well. All right. So it's really important to have multiple test dates, right? We recommend you plan for 3 testings of the same test. And here's why. So we talked about super scoring, right? You can take the best of scores. You also gain confidence over time. The first time taking a test is a little nerve-wracking, right? Just because it's 8 a.m., you don't want to be there, right? You didn't get a lot of sleep the night before. Who knows? Honestly, the test is not fun, right? It's a test. It's kind of boring. But the second time you do it, you know how it goes. You know what the plan's like. You feel a little better about it. Negates any test difficulty or scoring fluctuation. Again, right? Maybe there was more geometry than you expected. Maybe there was a really old reading passage that you just did not get. By kind of planning for extra tries in there, you negate anything like that happens. And it allows you to set incremental goals, right? Let's say you need to increase your ACT score by 4 points, out of a 36. We're not trying to do that in one go, right? We're giving ourselves some time to work towards that goal. So again, I recommend you plan for 3 and stop once you reach that goal. What's nice is you have lots of opportunities to take either test. I really like this slide. And this is kind of, I haven't mentioned this yet. So the idea behind how do you pick a test, right? Maybe you guys already had one test that you kind of heard about and you're like, as I was talking earlier, and you're like, that's definitely more me. Maybe you're on the fence, right? The first step is simply just to take a practice test of both, right? And you can do that many ways. Maybe you already have a PSAT score you can use. Maybe you have taken an official test of both. There are practice tests available online. We at Apple Ruth offer lots of practice tests too. Your school may offer them. Again, lots of options. The idea is you take a practice test of each test and simply start with, which one did I do better on, right? If they're about the same, then go with the one that you prefer, or maybe even the one that works better with your schedule. So this is kind of what you want to do. And once you've decided with that test, now you want to look at your schedule and figure out, when am I taking it, right? So again, right, we want to really plan on taking 3 of them. And so you'll see there's some nice little sets here in the calendar, right? October, November, December SATs are really great, all in 3 months. On the same hand, April, June, July ACTs are a really great 3 set. September, October ACT, December. Right, there's lots of good little sets built into the year, which help out a lot. We also want to think about things like extracurriculars. Does your student play a fall sport? If so, we're probably not doing any of these guys, right? Probably not even December either. So we want to start looking towards this guy. Maybe they're in the spring musical. On the other hand, we want to get rid of these. Maybe they just go away for summer camp every summer, and this is just not a possibility. So by thinking of this ahead of time, making this plan, you're not rushing to register for the ACT that's happening next week, right? You're saying, okay, I already know I'm taking it in April, June, and July. And so I know that, and maybe in February, I need to start thinking about studying for the April test, right? And then after I get those scores, I need to see how I did and work on studying for the June test. And then again, I kind of can see what is my last thing I need to improve here. So by planning ahead of time, you're also making your studying less stressful, right? You're thinking about, okay, if I do maybe an hour a week, you're not trying to cram anything in. It helps you, right? Also helps you think about any prep you want to do, right? Maybe you do want to take an SAT class, like a group class or something. Typically, the classes are going to start about 2 months, 2.5 months before the test. For example, more than likely, if you're taking an October SAT class, that probably started in like late July, right? So again, thinking about, okay, I need to register for that class way earlier than the test is, right? Often a class will be like 2 hours a week. So it makes sense why it's spaced out so much. So again, right, thinking about all this ahead of time is just going to save everyone a lot of stress, students and parents. So, sit down with your students, sit down with your family on that same document and think, okay, what dates work well for me, right? And again, work around your extracurriculars. You don't want to be trying to finish out the football season, finish finals, and study for some tests at the end of this fall, semester. Let's spread everything out and make it a little bit easier on you guys. So again, really great slide to kind of think about how you schedule everything out. And you have to take practice tests, right? I mentioned that you take a practice test to initially decide, but it's also important as you go, right? So you take that initial test to figure out which one do I want to take. Then as you're studying a little bit, you can kind of figure out where am I now, right? This is kind of a place to sit and take a benchmark. So these screenshots are from the Ruth score report that we send along with our practice tests. So the idea is that, you get to figure out patterns, right? Do you tend to miss a lot of questions at the end of each section? Maybe you just need to work on stamina, right? Maybe you're just getting tired. Maybe the SAT reading at 65 minutes is just too long of a section, right? We also look for wrong answer patterns, right? Maybe you are missing all the geometry questions and it's time to review that. Or maybe you missed a bunch of questions about punctuation in the English section. So it kind of helps you direct your studying. So you're not just, studying blindly, you're just practicing tests over and over again without actually improving. So again, mock tests and practice tests are really helpful to do this to help make your studying more efficient. Oops, sorry about that. So, right, we're getting all that prep and stuff like that. How has that changed in the past couple of years? So the new world order is largely test optional, right? Doesn't mean a strong test score isn't going to strengthen your application and potentially impact an admissions decision. So there are other things we've been doing the whole time that have always technically been optional as well, right? Like taking rigorous classes, submitting strong AP scores, demonstrating interest, joining clubs, doing leadership positions, right? None of these are required, but they definitely have been making a difference. So test scores have kind of just moved to being a similar idea as these, right? How can I use them to strengthen my application, not as like a minimum needed? So what does test optional mean, right? That a college will consider your application complete, even if you haven't submitted scores. They'll get some applications with and some applications without. They'll consider them both equally. For applications you have sent with test scores, they will look at them, right? It's not like they're going to ignore them if they're not helpful. They will look at them. So it just become more strategic, right? How are we thinking about which schools to send scores to and which schools not to? And that's really just, an extra decision to make, which of course is extra work, but something to think about. Also, there's been a historic number of applications post-pandemic, right? Taking away the requirement for test scores has, made some students feel like, okay, I have a better shot without them. Maybe I'll send in more applications. Also, it's just been, an economic barrier. It costs, I don't know, I think $15 to send in test scores every time. Some students just simply didn't have the resources to do that. So kind of across the board, applications have gone up. So you look like a big schools like NYU and UCLA, going up 30% is a lot of people. And then even something like a really small school like Colgate went up 146%. I'm sure that school probably has like a 4 or 5 person's admissions office and their work has just tripled, quadrupled. So it's been a little bit crazy for them, I'm sure. And this has an impact too, right? It kind of has made selectives become even more selective and just schools in general, right? Their admission rates have gone down. If you get more applications, doesn't mean you can accept more students. You still probably have about the same number of open spots every year, unless you've hired a bunch of people and built a bunch more dorms, right? And so if we look here, right, we see some, some big schools. There are some interesting jumps though, right? Something like MIT used to accept 7% of students. Now it's 3.9. That's about half, right? That's a much more difficult level there. Somewhere like Duke, a really big school, down from 11% to 4%. And then, one that's really noticeable is Auburn. So they used to accept 81% of students. Now it's 49%. Auburn used to be pretty likely for most students, like, okay, I feel pretty confident about this application. Now it's literally 50-50 if you get in, right? So it has changed a lot of things. And now we, as these schools become more selective, we want to make sure we're being smarter about how we're crafting each application for each individual school. Ivy admit rates plummeted as well, right? And of course, they were small to begin with. We see somewhere like Harvard that only accepts 4.6, and now it's 3.2. But if you think about it, right, 1 less percent is a lot harder to get in, right, at the end of the day. And even like, schools that, were, again, a little bit larger percentage, like Penn and Dartmouth at 9%, down to 6% or so, again, is a big chunk of students that aren't getting in here. So again, it's just become more selective, and so we want to be more careful about our applications. So with more applicants, fewer test scores, and less certainty regarding yield, right? Colleges at the end of the day are a business that do have to take in students and make tuition money, right? So if there are simply more students applying to a variety of colleges, it's harder to make sure that you're admitting the right kids who are going to come to the school. because at the end of the day, you need to fill your class because you need to get those tuition dollars to keep the organization running. So a lot of admissions offices have turned more to early decision. So early decision is where you kind of sign this contract almost saying, I'm applying to your school. Let's say it's Emory, for example. I'm going to apply to Emory early, like this application's due in like early October, because if you let me in, I'll promise I'll go there. And, you know, that's really appealing to a lot of schools because, you know, that's a little bit less work, right? Those applications are often a little shorter. And that student promises they'll go there, right? So if their application looks good, they seem like they'll be a good fit, it's much more appealing to take that student in, to go ahead and fill the class and guarantee those, you know, people are going to be filling in those spaces. So if we look at some of these, right, think about if you wanted to go to University of Virginia, really, really large school. But if you're applying regular decision, by the time your application is submitted, 30% of that freshman class is already filled with early decision kids. Again, down there with Emory or Duke, that's 50% as well. 50% of the seats have already been taken. So that's, you know, think about it. You really are just, you know, really competing for a huge number of, with a huge number of students for 50% of the seats. So it just has changed it a lot and has changed, you know, how important early decision and things like that are. Why do test scores still matter for a lot of schools? Well, they're a hedge against grade inflation. Honestly, many schools across the US now have done different strategies for making many of their kids have 4.0s and 5.0s and 6.0s and all these crazy ways to do it, right? At the end of the day, having all A's isn't super special across the country anymore because of things like that grade inflation. Test scores have historically been a strong predictor of graduation, right? They can say confidently that students with high test scores tend to graduate college within 4 years. That's a number they keep track of. They're also a helpful way to compare a broad, diverse group of applicants for like a state school. Let's say, for example, you have two students applying for a state school. One student grew up in a rural area. Their high school was pretty small. They were valedictorian. They only offered 3 AP classes, but they took all 3 of them, right? And they really, really spent a lot of time working in one club, right? There were many clubs. There's not a lot of students. Let's say, on the other hand, you have a student growing up in a metropolitan area. They were valedictorian, but they were top 10% of their class. Their school offered 18 AP classes, and they took 15 of them. And they were in like 5 different clubs in pretty good positions. At the end of the day, these students' grades are the same. What are you going to do, right? These are such different students, but at the end of the day, you can't compare the number of AP exams they took. That's simply not fair. The number of clubs they were in, again, simply not fair. So test scores are a good way to compare those students. Those are objective scores from an outside company, right? You know, if one student has 50 points higher, it's easier to take that student in. On the other hand, right, might differentiate students who look similar otherwise, right? Let's say there's 2 students from that metropolitan area. They both took all 18 AP classes. They're both valedictorians. They're both presidents of clubs. They both have 4.0s or whatever the number is. They look the same. What are you going to do? One student has a 100-point higher SAT than the other. That's just easier to take, right? So it still matters. It still helps differentiate you in a lot of situations. And they're still required by public colleges in some states. This is just a couple examples, right? So we have FSU, Florida, FAMU, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Tennessee, all still require them. So again, if your list includes some schools that require the tests, you're going to have to take the tests, right? That's how it is at the end of the day. A relatively small but significant number of schools won't use them at all. That's called test blind. So in case you come across that in your research, that's a little bit different. Again, very small number of schools do this, but just in case, that means they just don't look at test scores. They won't accept them at all. Not submitting test scores can affect merit aid sometimes as well, right? So maybe your state has a state-run scholarship program. A lot of southern states do. So Louisiana, South Carolina, and Georgia do, for example. And sometimes to get that scholarship, you have to submit a test score. In Georgia, for example, there's a Zell Miller scholarship that pays for 100% of your tuition. It's a GPA requirement, and you do have to submit a test score as well. That's just part of getting the money, right? So again, you got to take it anyway, right? You have to take it anyway to get that money. Some schools also just offer money anyway, right? Like University of Alabama, for example. If you submit a test score, like let's say you submit a 28 on your ACT, you automatically get $10,000 if you have the matching GPA. That is a lot of money. On the same hand too, right? Let's say you have a 29 on your ACT, you're automatically going to get $15,000. But if you take the test again, you study a little bit and you get that score up to a 30, you get $24,000. And that is a big difference, right? So again, once you've narrowed down that list of schools, you are doing all the research you can to look for all these things that may change the stuff that you have on your to-do list, right? This is a big difference in money, and this is a big reason to do some work and try to bump up that test score. So should I send them in with my application though? For schools like the scholarships? Yes, right, if they match the scholarship requirements. The question is that, are they going to add value to the application, right? Is it something that you want them to see? Do they make sense with the rest of the things you've submitted, right? Let's say your GPA is like in the middle ground, right? You did pretty well at the end, but you had a lot of trouble. Let's say your sophomore year of high school, you had some personal things going on and made your GPA drop. But you've worked so hard. You got all A's your junior year. You are just doing amazing. You have a really stellar test score. That test score shows the improvement you've done, right? And it tells a really good story. On the other hand, maybe it's the other way around, right? Maybe you're really great in classes. You've got that perfect 4.0, and you just have a really hard time taking the test for whatever reason. If it doesn't make sense with the rest of your application, you may not want it there, right? Things too, like the programs you're applying to, right? So this person says there's admission rates that are really similar between those with and without test scores, sometimes except in STEM and business, right? Students with higher test scores get it at higher rates, right? Again, it's an objective way to show that you are good at math or science or whatever that is. On the other hand, right, more majors, right? Things like fine arts or classical music majors or things you have to audition for, probably okay if you have a test score below average, because that's probably not exactly what they're looking at, right? So again, it probably wouldn't hurt if you're applying to those kinds of programs as well. So whether to submit depends on your GPA. This is what I was saying a second ago. I got ahead of myself, right? Average scores in a week in your profile if everything else is top notch, right? Test scores well below your grades doesn't really make any sense, doesn't tell a story. Test scores really above your grades helps tell a story, right? So again, right, it may be that you had a really bad year freshman year and your recent grades have been great, but of course your overall GPA can only go up so much. A stellar test score tells a really good story for you. Individual section scores matter too, right? So for example, not all 1400s on the SAT are created equal. So let's say a student is applying to a selective engineering program. They have a 1400, which is a pretty good score, but they have a 600 verbal and an 800 math. 800 math is a perfect math score. Oh, that looks awesome for this engineering program. That's a really great addition to your application. On the other hand, let's say there are other students also applying to that program, but they have the 600 math and 800 verbal. That one I wouldn't feel as great, as confident about for this particular engineering program, right? Because it doesn't really show that leaning on math that they would expect. Maybe if you're applying for a very limited like humanities program, that's awesome, So kind of think about this, right? Are you applying for anything specific? Is there anything in your test scores that shows a strength that you want to show off? You can't unsee a weak score at the end of the day, right? So a weak test score inevitably becomes part of the conversation. So you want to make sure that you are thinking about which schools you do and don't send test scores to. So again, it just means you're making more decisions and you're being more careful about what you're doing in your applications. So again, just remind yourself this at the end of the day, does my score add to my application or not? What about the SATs? Some brief changes about the SAT also. So the SAT ended the subject test and the essay in 2021. They did begin digital testing. They will begin international digital testing this March 2023. They'll do US digital testing next March of 2024. So what that means is that if you are class of 2025, so people who are currently sophomores, yes, it's currently sophomores, you're in an interesting spot. So current sophomores can probably take the test either way. If they take the SAT, they can do paper or digital because of the timing. If you're beyond 2025, it's likely you're going to take the digital SAT. So we are still trying to learn more about it. We don't really know a whole lot right now. I recommend signing up for the Apple Ruth newsletter or checking out our blog. We do keep a lot of news on there that helps keep you up to date about these changes. So as a reminder, we're ready, right? We've been on the cutting edge of testing for 20 years. We currently offer fixed form digital SATs and ACTs. And as we learn more, right, as I said, we'll prepare new materials and kind of send out news for you guys. And to finish off, we'll talk about next steps by grade, right? So freshman year, right? Focus on your grades, right? Increase rigor as appropriate. Your honors math class is easy peasy. Think about taking an AP math class if possible. Explore activities, right? Find a club that really interests you, right? And really dedicate yourself to it. The October PSAT practice for the practice. This was, of course, this past October. So kind of, it's just good to see how you do, right? See if, where your starting point is and start to think about colleges, right? Those around you, places you visited, people that have gone to different colleges. So again, you're just kind of brainstorming now, setting a good baseline, a good foundation. Sophomore year, right? Focus on your grades. There's no sophomore slump, right? You want to keep those up. Again, add more rigorous classes as needed. Your October PSAT this past year was still just practicing. Start joining clubs, start maybe trying to get leadership positions. Make your summers count, right? Maybe you get a summer job, an internship, academic programs. Maybe you try to be a counselor at the camp you used to go out all the time or something. And as a reminder, your class will be the first with the option to take the digital SAT. So again, start thinking about your testing plan early to figure this out, right? Especially if you feel like you're someone who wants to take the paper one instead. That means you need to take the SAT the fall of your junior year. Of course, the ACT hasn't said anything about going digital. So if you're an ACT person, we haven't really heard anything about that yet. Let's say you're a junior right now. Again, this is kind of weird because we're in a spring semester. So perhaps you need to think about what you're going to be in the fall. Get ready. It's pretty tough. Junior year is tough. The classes you get are tough, right? They start, really giving you some stuff that's going to prep you for college. Make sure your schedule's challenging, but not overwhelming, right? If your grades start to slip way too much, it's too much too soon, right? It's not worth the rigor or taking an AP class if it hurts your GPA. And it's time to start college stuff, right? You're going to take the PSAT and it's going to be important this time around. Right? And go, right? Start figuring out what test you want to prep for, when to take it, explore the scholarships, look at colleges, start to make that list, right? Because the idea is that you start applying fall of your senior year. So the time is now to get everything ready, right? And lastly, a senior year, right? Finish strong. Your grades do still count this year. If they see some sort of crazy change, the college will be suspicious and confused. Set goals, work to achieve them, right? Apply to schools that match your criteria that are good options for you, right? Say thank you to people who have helped you along the way. Pay attention to details, right? Application deadlines, financial aid deadlines, check your email for these. Sometimes there's extra deadlines for applying for things like an honors college or a summer program or something at your school of choice. So something to keep an eye on. Again, this is a spring semester, so probably think about what you're going to be in the fall when we're talking about these timelines here. Okay, that was a lot, right? All right, so before we start the Q&A, there's going to be a poll put in the chat. So if you guys don't mind filling that out for me, that just lets us know a little bit more about you guys and how we can further help you. So you should see that in just a moment. All right, and whenever you guys are done with that, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. I'm happy to talk about any piece of the presentation. As a reminder, we started off with the SAT versus ACT, the process of how the tests work. We talked a little bit about how to prepare for college. We talked about changes in the testing world, and then we talked about timelines by student as well. Okay, so one question we often get in this situation is, when should I start taking the test, right? And one thing that's really important to think about is, when does your student take Algebra II? So Algebra II makes up a large portion of the math sections on both the SAT and the ACT. So for example, if you are a sophomore in Algebra II, right, you can probably take the tests as early as summer before junior year, right, or in your junior year. If you're a junior in Algebra II, you are better to start testing in the spring of your junior year. because you want to make sure you have at least as much Algebra 2 under your belt as you can before you start testing. The ideal situation is to start testing at the end of that spring, so like in April, or May, and then a summer test or two. That works out best for you because, again, Algebra 2 is really important for that math score. Somebody got a question. Will this recording be posted? I believe so. Yes, I believe it will be emailed to you, either the recording or the presentation. I'm not 100% sure. That's a good question. Are there any other questions? Like I said, I'm happy to talk about any of these topics, to go deeper into any of them. So as a reminder, it's really great that you guys are here, right? Because it's helpful to get ahead of all this stuff and make a plan ahead of time. Awesome. Okay. So if you concentrate on one section of the SAT at a time and you do extremely poorly on the other section, does that hurt you? Even though the school's super scoring, do they look unfavorably at the low score? Okay, that's a good question. So the idea behind that is that, right, so 90% of schools, right, when they get that super score, they're going to look at that, and the page they get is just going to be like, Heather's SAT, and it's going to have score, and then like in fine print at the bottom, it's going to have like details or whatever, right? That's kind of the page the colleges see. Most colleges are just going to be like, cool, super score, excellent, move on. Some schools may, and I forget the phrasing for this, but you'll kind of see a phrasing. It's like all scores considered or something like that. They will look at those, right? And so that's usually really small private liberal arts colleges that do something like that. So for the most part, no. The only thing I would be concerned about if there's something really crazy, right? A really big variety is concerning, right? Let's say you take the SAT and you start off with a 450 and a 600. That's not too far apart. But if you're getting like a 450 and a 750, I'd start to be concerned about the gap between those two scores, right? You know, that kind of shows there's some sort of huge gap going on there. So again, as long as it's not too huge, you have nothing to worry about there. Question though. All right. Okay. Are there any particular SAT or ACT tests that are easier than the other? Nope. Just a rumor, one of those things that just keeps standing the test of time. There are no tests that are easier than the other. Like, it's not that the December one is better or anything. Oh, thank you for coming in. Okay, how does the PSAT score relate to potential SAT and ACT score? Yeah, that's a really good question. So, for example, your PSAT score is pretty much related to your SAT score. So if you got a PSAT of 1100, not 11,000, you are very likely going to get an SAT of 1100. That's how they kind of design it, so it's really comparable. But so the PSAT is actually shorter than the SAT. There's fewer questions. And so the max score you can get is 1570. The SAT example max score you can get is 1600. So that's a little bit different. And because of this, higher scoring students tend to have that off. So for example, a higher scoring student scoring like a 1550, you're probably more in the 1580 range on the actual SAT. So for the most students, totally normal. Higher scoring students is a little bit off as far as that goes. So to compare SAT versus ACT scores, I recommend just doing a quick little Google search. You pretty much say like SAT, ACT comparison tables, and there's dozens online, and I pretty much think most of them are the same. And it'll tell you like this is off the top of my head, this is not right. 1100 is about a 24 or whatever. It'll tell you the numbers. Like I said, I don't think those numbers are right, but that's the phrase you want to look for online. Those are really easy to find. It'll help you convert those. So like I said, the PSAT score should be pretty much what you expect to get on the SAT. And then you can find a comparison table just to convert that over to ACT numbers. Again, higher scoring students a little bit different in that situation. Just keep that in mind. All right, do colleges see how many times you take the SAT or ACT? So kind of similar to like, have they seen all the scores you have? Most schools aren't going to pay attention to it. Again, they're just going to look at the super score on the first page. The only thing I think that would be a little bit something to think about is, again, those really small liberal arts schools that tend to look at all the times you've taken it. Maybe Ivy Leagues might look at how many times you've taken it. And the thing too is that I wouldn't stress yourself to take it a lot of times. I think ultimately, like, they allow you to take it unlimited number of times, but please don't do that. Really, in the history of Apple Ruth, as we've seen, we rarely see students' scores increase past 4 tests. And again, we really don't see it much after 3 tests either. But the idea is, like, for example, I talked about that Alabama scholarship earlier. If you need one more point, that's kind of when you take a 4th test to try to just squeeze one more point out of something. 3 tests is really where we see a lot of students' progress stop. So yes and no, I guess they could see if they wanted to. Most schools really don't care, but I wouldn't take it a crazy number of times. I do think that would flag something. Okay, what's an average SAT increase after completing one of your tutoring programs? I think this is on our website. These numbers may not be 100% correct, but the idea behind our programs is that if you are doing a private program, you work with a tutor for 20 hours, you do all your homework, all that good stuff. I believe the increase is about 150 or so. Again, not 100% on the exact number there. It is on our website though. But those are kind of the jumps you can see. And that's a reasonable jump, right? I would say 100 points is a reasonable jump for most people to make. Again, of course, unless you're on the tippy top of the scale, you simply can't go up that many. With focused practice and really taking practice tests as well, that's something that's pretty reasonable for most students. All right, so I'm going to stay for more questions, but if you guys don't have any questions, you are free to go. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Like I said, I'm going to stay on just in case there's any more questions as well. Right, okay, so yeah, can I send the recording link? So the recording will be emailed to you later this week. I just got confirmation. You should receive it in the same email you got the link for this webinar. Yeah, thank you guys for coming. Can I explain how and why the SAT questions get tougher? Okay. I'm going to explain this the way I'm understanding this question, but if that's not the way you meant it, let me know. So as far as questions that get tougher, on the SAT, the only section that gets tougher as it goes is math. So it starts out easy and gets harder. That's what you meant. Oops. Okay. Math starts easier and gets harder as it goes. And so that's the only section on the SAT that gets harder as it goes. And so the reason the PSAT max score is lower is because they theoretically have taken off 30 points worth of material and stuff. But maybe you're talking about the reading section. You either get easier or hard questions. I'm not really sure I understand that question. I'm sorry. Sorry, I've said so much this evening. So you could be thinking about the digital SAT, which is also a little bit different. It's not fixed form, it's an adaptive test. So what that means is that everyone gets the same first round of questions. Then, depending on how you did on those, if you had trouble with those, you get easier second round of questions, or you get harder second round if you did well on those, if that makes sense. It's called adaptive testing. That's the digital SAT. Sorry, I don't understand things. Okay, yes, you got it. Thank you. Perfect. Yeah, so that's a little bit different. I do believe we offer a presentation about the digital SAT all on its own, which kind of describes that some more, but that's the phrase you're looking for, is adaptive testing. And I'm sure you can look for that maybe in probably a blog about it on our website. Yeah, there we go, we got it. Okay, so other question, maximum jump between tests is 150 alone. So let's kind of start the maximum jump. That's just a really common jump. So that's kind of, like I said, with our program, that's the average you can expect for the most part. Again, it all depends on where you're starting, right? So, for students, on the SAT, for example, let's say they're starting it at the middle of their junior year. They haven't quite finished Algebra II yet. And let's say they needed some help with their math, right? Maybe their math started at 500. Then simply by finishing Algebra 2 and by really working hard with their tutor, it is not crazy for, the math to jump up just that one section to jump up higher, right? The idea is that, the lower you start, the more, potential there is, of course. But it all depends on many things, right? Does your student need accommodations? Do they need to relearn algebra? All kinds of things go into that as well. If the digital is adaptive, then won't it be unfair as it is now not the same set of questions for all? I don't know. That's a good question, right? Theoretically, that is more fair, supposedly, because it makes sure that there's way less opportunities for cheating and such. But I would definitely have to, again, the SAT is its own private company. I'm sorry, the College Board is. So, who knows what they're thinking about that, unfortunately. Like I said, we'll have to see more data. We haven't even seen people actually take the test really either. Once we start to see students actually take the test, we'll learn more about how, equitable and stuff, all that stuff is. Yeah. What does accommodations mean? Yeah, exactly. So accommodations is when you have, been diagnosed with a something that makes, a learning difference like ADHD or dyslexia or something like that, right? So to help make it fair for you, often you'll get extra time on a test or something like that, right? Because it simply takes you longer to read it, perhaps. So sometimes you'll get those through your school, right? So you always get extra time on your math test and your math class. Well, often those do convert over to things like the SAT and ACT, which makes sense, right? It's only fair to give you extra time on those as well. So an accommodation is something that you would kind of already know you have. You've been to like a psychologist or a doctor or something and gotten that doctor's note. But yeah, so the fact that kids in high school now were forced to attend school for online for 1.5 years affect test scores, or is it too early to tell? That's a really good question. And the answer is, yeah, we've seen the scores drop a little bit. I don't have the numbers right here. We have another presentation with those numbers, and it is interesting. We have seen them drop, right? If Algebra 1 was all online, that is the core for a lot of other things, right? So yeah, it has affected it. But the idea, right? So when you are applying compared to all other kids at your stage. So it has affected kind of our overall numbers. But when you're being compared with other kids your same age, it hasn't really affected that too much, right? It's kind of like the admit rates or anything like that part of it. But yeah, no, we've seen it affect test scores a little bit, which has been interesting. That's kind of why schools will recalibrate their scores every year, right? That's why we look at things like freshman profile to see, okay, what about the kids last year? What did they get accepted as? Those numbers are probably very different than kids from 3 years ago or so. All right, well, there's no other questions. Last call for questions. Oh, we got more. Aren't test optional schools seeing inflated median scores because lower ones aren't submitted? Yeah, that's also true, right? I think we have seen that as well in the scores we've seen, right? So the data I'm talking about is I have seen some data from a school, right? So a high school is showing its scores and their scores overall have dropped because of the online year. But if you look at overall scores that test optional schools are accepting year on year, that one, yeah, you're right, probably higher just because of that. Right, but that kind of changes, right? Why we think about, which schools do we send test scores into or not? We think about, what has changes about them. But yeah, you're definitely right on that one too. Yeah, the colleges see how many times take the test. So I mean, they technically can, right? But many schools won't really care unless it's a weird number of times. It's kind of my warning. I would say that would be a flag. Technically, you can take it unlimited times. Anything beyond 4 is not really helpful at the end of the day. And even 3 is probably the limit for most students. Some maybe really small private liberal arts schools maybe look at them a little more in detail, but you don't see that super often. So thankfully, not too much of a worry unless you take it 15 times. That would be stressful anyway, so don't do that. All right, awesome. Well, once again, thank you guys for joining me this evening. We had a lot of good questions, a lot of good conversations. So hopefully you guys can join us for another webinar sometime. Like I said, we offer webinars about, test optional applications. We talk about digital SATs, lots of other kind of detailed ones. I really invite you guys to join us for. This seems like they should answer a lot of your more detailed questions as well. Like I said, you should get the recording later on this week. And I think that's it. I hope you guys have a great evening, and thanks again for joining us.